There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott, and guest starring with me this evening for a conversation about these two Twilight Zone episodes. It's Joe. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Scott. Hello, everybody.
Glad to have you back. I was very tempted to go, hello, Joe.
How do you know?
I had a feeling you might be the only person who would get that reference. But we are here to talk Twilight Zone. It's funny, I was just watching a little bit of one of them again a few minutes before we started recording, and I became aware of the fact that depending where you watch these episodes, because I'm alternating between watching them on Paramount Plus, and I also have a DVD set that was probably put out, who knows, 10, 15, 18 years ago, whenever they were doing DVD box sets like that. And I'm realizing, depending where you watch these, you may see something somewhat different. For the DVD has a different opening than the episodes on Paramount Plus. The oddity is the opening that's on Paramount Plus is the correct opening. The opening that's on the DVD is not correct. That opening shouldn't have been used until the last 4 episodes of season 1. Meanwhile, the DVD features the endings that have Rod Serling talking to the camera about what the next episode was going to be, and he would usually mention, something about whoever the star was of the next episode, or there might be a prop he might be making a special little cryptic hint about. Same thing Hitchcock tended to do as well, oddly enough. So they had that in common. But you certainly don't get that on the other episodes. And I don't think when we watched these when we were kids, when they were being syndicated, they would tend to have the endings, because when they were syndicated, they weren't necessarily showing them in any sort of order. So, but yet I have memories of it, so I keep thinking that maybe sometimes they did show them. I'm not sure. Do you remember that at all when you were watching?
No, are you talking about the previews for the next episode?
Yeah, when Mr. Sterling would talk about the next episode, it seemed like I did see them, but I think maybe nowadays they're cut off. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I do have a recollection of that, but not every time, or I don't know. And for what it's worth, so far, and I might change this as we go further down the road on our podcast, but I've been watching on Paramount Plus, so I'm getting the next week on Twilight Zone. Tune in for so and so is starring in this, and I like that. That's kind of cool.
That's excellent. Oh, I put one on, and I got a little ad at the end for the Danny Thomas show, so it was just amazing.
But I do have the option of Blu-ray. I have them all on Blu-ray too, so
there you go.
I could go either way.
So let's get to tonight's podcast, where we will be covering 2 more Twilight Zone episodes. We will be covering Mr. Denton on Doomsday and the 16mm Shrine, which are the 3rd and 4th episodes from the first season of The Twilight Zone. So let's start it off with Mr. Denton on Doomsday. Now, Mr. Denton on Doomsday was directed by Alan Resner, who worked mainly as a television director for nearly 40 years, covering multiple genres and ending his career with a handful of episodes of Murder, She Wrote. But he actually got his big break on a series I would love one day to be able to track down. I don't know if it's available anywhere beyond perhaps a visit to one of those museums of old television shows. We got a couple of them here in New York City. This was a series that likely no one either remembers or is probably even aware of, but it actually has more episodes than The Twilight Zone, and it ran from 1954 through 1958. It was an anthology series called Climax. Have you ever heard of this series?
I know a lot about TV, and I don't think I've ever heard of that.
It's amazing. See, Rod Serling, he actually met Alan Reisner on that series when Reisner was a director of an episode that Serling had adapted for television, a boxing story, of course. Reisner actually directed 32 episodes of that series. And an interesting little note for cinephiles out there, there's a long stretch where he basically alternated directing episodes with a guy who had become somewhat more famous as a director, John Frankenheimer, who oddly enough got mentioned in our previous podcast. Actually, the one thing that Climax might be very famous for, this might be the one thing that might ring a bell with you. And I went, oh, is that where it was from? The very first adaptation of a James Bond story, Casino Royale, happened on that series. That's probably its biggest claim to fame. The first live action version of James Bond was on the series Climax.
Interesting. I'm fast. I'm gonna have to look that up because and you're saying it had as many or more episodes?
More episodes.
That's crazy.
More
I mean,
episodes.
it's one thing to have an obscure show that lasted 6 episodes or maybe even a season, and then gets forgotten. But something with that kind of volume is usually remembered.
You think I think it's because it ran specifically only in the 50s, and unless you're like a Honeymooners or I Love Lucy, a lot of those things didn't really stand the test of time when they were anthology series. Because we've heard of the certain live action series from that era, the Playhouse this and whatever, so on and so forth. But apparently there were a lot of these little series that were done. But this one, it was 5 years, but remember, these were the days where they would have like 30-something episodes of television per season. I mean, they had like 37 episodes some seasons.
This is like the episodic version of the first Super Bowl doesn't exist on tape anywhere.
Exactly, right. So back to Mr. Reisner here. I do believe Mr. Denton on Doomsday was only the second time he had ever directed something that would be considered a Western story, though he did go on to direct episodes of various iconic Western TV shows like Rawhide and Gunsmoke. The episode was written by Rod Serling, say no more. Let's move on to the cast, and I think we both recognize a number of people in this cast. First, you have Dan Duryea, who plays the title character. Duryea had a very nice career that started on Broadway, which led to him working with iconic film stars like Gary Cooper, Humphrey Bogart, Edward G. Robinson. He did tend to work more on television in his so-called later years, which sadly was cut very short because he died at the age of 61, within almost weeks after he was diagnosed with cancer. Malcolm Atterbury plays the peddler Henry J. Fate. This guy had an incredibly long and varied career as a versatile character actor. He's in everything from Hitchcock films to episodes of Quincy and the Odd Couple. I mean, you can find him in so many things, including at least one more episode of Twilight Zone, which is going to pop up in the 4th season. Soap opera fans probably recognize the woman that's in this episode, Liz, played by Jean Cooper. Now, while Miss Cooper also had a long career mainly in dozens and dozens of TV series over the years, little doubt she's probably best known for starring in more than 1,600 episodes, playing mainly, and I say mainly because there's probably an evil twin or two in there somewhere, mainly playing Catherine Chancellor on The Young and the Restless. And that run only ended because of her actual passing in 2013. And
we're ironic about that, too, is her character named Liz Smith was the name of a TV journalist who I believe covered a lot of soap operas in her day.
Oh, yeah, Liz Smith used to work for the Daily News here. The other thing I didn't know that Jean Cooper might be known for until I just watched the commentary on this episode that was done by the next actor I'm going to mention. She's also the mother of Corbin Burnson. I did not know that until like 45 minutes ago. And since I just made a slight reference to him, I have to mention one other guy of note here. The town jerk, the bully, who taunts and mocks Denton mercilessly. It's played by Martin Landau. Now, the two of us could probably spend an entire podcast and beyond going over the career of Martin Landau. Either you remember him as the evil henchman Leonard from North by Northwest, or we fast forward past his years of television and we get to his incredible second win in his career, where he really, I think, became a more full-fledged movie star in films like Crimes and Misdemeanors, and of course, his great Oscar-winning turn in Ed Wood. Um, the only thing I would probably want to point out that some folks might not have known about Martin Landau, if you were to flip through his credits, or actually I just heard him talk about it, especially through the late 50s and early 60s, Landau appeared in a lot of TV westerns, almost always playing the bad guy. I think there's one I found that he was actually playing Doc Holliday, but otherwise he's always playing bad guys in westerns. And it's just funny because he's just a guy from Brooklyn. And for about 4 or 5 years, I think I looked up, he was in like at least 14 or 15 different westerns. That's a lot.
Well, the funny part is, like, as a kid, my introduction to him, with probably similar to a lot of people in our audience, was Space 1999. So he's a little more heroic in that one as opposed to villainous, or, well, I don't know. I guess I don't know if that's accurate or not, but my point is, as I've gotten older and learned and seen more of his career, it's many villainous turns.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, how can we not? How can we forget his wonderful villainous turn in? Yeah, I'm going to say every episode I'm going to mention Columbo, because he does play a villain in an episode of Columbo, of course. I also like the fact that there's this weird thing connecting him to Leonard Nimoy, because if I'm not mistaken, he originally tried out to play Spock, and then Nimoy got the job. Then years later, he was the one who was on Mission Impossible, and when he left Mission Impossible, who takes his place essentially on the show? Leonard Nimoy. So I just like that. And then, like, wait a minute, I can be the star of a sci-fi show, Space 1999. That'll be my Star Trek. It wasn't, but I do remember it being on in a local station here. I should also mention he will appear on another Twilight Zone episode, that was done a few years later. That was directed by some kid named Richard Donner. Don't know who that is, Joe. Who could that be?
No, I don't know the guy.
So let me get to the actual episode now. And Mr. Serling's opening for this episode was as follows. Portrait of a town drunk named Al Denton. This is a man who's begun his dying early, a long, agonizing route through a maze of bottles. Al Denton, who would probably give an arm or a leg or a part of his soul to have another chance to be able to rise up and shake the dirt from his body and the bad dreams that infest his consciousness. Now, at this point, the camera shot kind of switches to focus on a different character wearing a rather pensive expression as he stands near a stagecoach. In the parlance of the times, this is a peddler, a rather fanciful-looking little man in a black frock coat. And then suddenly, next to Al Denton, who's lying on the ground, a pistol mysteriously appears next to him. And this is the third principal character of our story. Its function, perhaps to give Mr. Al Denton his second chance. Now, beyond that opening, which I think really sets up the character so beautifully and poignantly, the story unfolds as Denton, the town drunk, unexpectedly and somewhat bewilderingly recaptures his stature of glory from years ago when he was known for being lightning fast on the draw. But he remembers how that life went and where it led, and he's fearful it's going to go the same way, only this time more likely lead to his death rather than the bottom of a bottle. But that gun is not the only mysterious and possibly magical element to guide Denton's path, as the aptly named peddler is most definitely not of this world, and I would say he's probably the actual conduit to the Twilight Zone. Hey, that's my little... So, Joe, I got to say, I know that this is not the flashiest or twistiest or darkest episode of the Twilight Zone by any stretch of the imagination. But me, I'm a sucker for Westerns. I don't care if they're on the silver screen or the TV screen. I love the archetypes. I love the cliches. I love it all. In fact, one of the things I've written myself, my favorite work that I've written is actually a Western. So I have always had a lot of affection for this episode, which I believe succeeds with what I call, and I might have said this before, an amazing economy of plotting and dialogue. I mean, it certainly has the same running time as most any other episode from the half-hour base seasons, but damn if it didn't feel like it only ran 15 minutes.
Well, in fact, both of these episodes that we're covering today, I was sort of the same feeling. is I didn't have a strong memory of either of them. And as we said in our first podcast, I've seen every episode, but I just didn't have a strong. I remember the title of this episode actually more than I think the content of the episode. So in a way, this was sort of like watching it new or fresh to me, which is a nice perspective to also have. And one of the things that struck me was, and this is kind of almost speaking the obvious about Twilight Zone, although there's some clunkers, but just how well done it was. And just like, these are people at the top of their craft of writing, producing, a zippy half hour of television, acting, so on and so forth. I'm just saying the quality of this, not just this episode, but just this series was, like, this is good stuff. So it was, that was sort of my almost fresh-eyed take, if you will, with this one.
Yeah. The thing with the Twilight Zone episode, I mean, one might even say this about all of them, even the ones that we might not like as much as others. And I agree, there's going to be a few that I'm not the biggest fan of. We might hear about that one shortly, actually. But nevertheless, even in the lesser episodes, they're still significant pieces of television. I love that they don't waste time. And especially when you have someone like Rod Serling himself doing the writing, or the other writers that we'll get to talk about in future episodes who are all really highly skilled at their craft. They pack a lot into these episodes, and especially when you consider it's an anthology series. So anthology series tend to be very plot driven because it's the story. It's like, here's a story. We're gonna, we got 22 minutes to have a beginning, middle, and end, and someone's gonna get their just desserts or the moral of the story, blah blah blah, whatever. And yet, I have never seen. I cannot recall a Twilight Zone episode where I didn't feel I got a significant amount of character as well. The characters are always so well defined and made clear and are vivid. And you know what I like in Twilight Zone too? I was thinking about this the other day because, you doing, the quote unquote, the writer perspective, because there's been a lot of, whether it be TV series or anthology series or just TV in general. And we can go on about how great certain shows are compared to others, especially in the last 25 years, everything from The Sopranos to Breaking Bad and so on and so forth. The way I look at a show like The Twilight Zone and as far as storytelling, I almost feel like it's almost like the Aesop's fables of writing and storytelling, because it's so classic and it's done in such a way where it's universal. It's, it's clearly drawn. The characters are always going to be memorable. But it's also so the story is just as, if not more important. And there's usually something which is going to come and hit you in the face at the end, in one way or another, good or bad. And I was thinking about it, like, what? That's what Aesop's fables did all the time.
The messages in the Twilight Zone are not subtle, or the themes, the messages, whatever. And I'm not even saying that is a bad thing. In fact, especially as a kid, kind of consuming those messages and fables or whatever, I think it's good to see it through the lens of drama. For those who didn't listen to our first episode, and by all means, you should go back and do that if you haven't. I had mentioned that at the Writers Guild 10 or 15 years ago, we had voted on the best written show of all time, and I had voted for Twilight Zone as the number one, and I don't remember exactly where it ended up, but it was top 5 of all time, voted by other writers. So we could see this every episode for the rest of the series, but writing is outstanding.
Well, look at it this way. Television and the medium of television has been around for however long we want to say it's been a long time. If you want to go back to the weird little shows that, 7 people got to see in the 1940s, you can go back that far or even further. I remember my history of television classes. It really kicks in more from like the beginning of the 50s on. So I really think of it being 75 years of real television, whatever. I would be hard pressed, and there may be. I haven't done the research. I haven't Googled it or whatever. I haven't asked Jeeves. We're talking about antiquated things before our podcast. We've seen, we've seen any number of shows over the years that have gotten reboots. You know, Battlestar Galactica came back. You know, Magnum PI came back for good or for bad. You know, those got an example of one good, one bad there, whatever. I don't think there's a show that's been brought back in another incarnation as many times as the Twilight Zone, because not including the movie, and if I could include the movie because that sort of counts, but I won't because I'm just staying within the medium of television. There's been 3 more Twilight Zone series since the original Twilight Zone. And I always forget about one because I knew that Jordan Peele did one recently. And there's the one from the 1980s. I actually have that set. I have that set on DVD as well because there's some really noteworthy episodes in there. I forgot there was one in between that Forrest Whitaker apparently hosted. But I'm saying like that, you think about that 3 times, you know.
And Twilight Zone copycat shows like Amazing Stories and the one short-lived one that James Coburn hosted, the name's escaping me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I can't
Dark
remember what
Room
it was.
or something like that.
Well,
Anyway.
to some it's one of those things. On one hand, to some extent, Twilight Zone begat a lot of series that came after it. But as I was just noting earlier, there were actually anthology series before Twilight Zone that kind of led to like that show Climax, where Rod Serling himself worked. Kind of leads to, you know, Night Gallery was a show that Serling did, but obviously, you know, that is built on the heels of the Twilight Zone. But you could say that about, you know, The Outer Limits. Or do you remember this other show that would be on? It was on in my market, but it was always on like at 4:30 or 5 in the morning. But I'm the insane child who'd be up at that hour because, you know, Twilight Zone was on at 1 in the morning. But if I stayed up to like 4:30 or 5, there was a show that was called One Step Beyond. It was basically, it was like a more static, just kind of pensive version of the Twilight Zone. I don't know, because it always kind of left me kind of going like, oh, I don't know if I'm scared or bored. It's kind of a combination.
Well, you know, one sort of just general observation I was thinking of when I saw this is, you know, you said you like Westerns, and I enjoy Westerns too, but you know, the trope of, and I think it's fair to call it that, the trope of the aging gunslinger or the fastest gunslinger that every hotshot is trying to take over is, I don't know if I want to say overdone, but you know, it's done a lot. And you know, I always find that kind of curious. It's like, what is this in our human DNA that we either recognize these characters or we have the hot shot? I mean, you know, and it phases into other things like a young boxer or you know, a gang member or something. But we always have this, we got to take on the top person. And in this particular case, as we've seen in other similar type Westerns, well, the top person is no longer the top person, or they're tired of being the top person, or, you know, that fame is wearing on them and blah, 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 blah. And it's just a story that has been, you know, a tale as old as time, is, you know, to borrow a phrase from another classic.
Well, it's funny you should bring that up because, especially when we're referring to earlier on in the episode, there's this monologue that Denton has when he's talking to Liz about his past. And he describes how word spread of him being the fastest draw in the West, which would inspire people to show up day after day to challenge him until, you know, he ended up turning to drink after being called out by a 16-year-old boy that he shot and killed. That, as you probably know, but I'm jumping on this because it's one of my all-time favorite films. That was genuinely and literally parodied in Blazing Saddles. There you had the scene with the Waco Kid, the Gene Wilder character, who was renowned as the fastest and deadliest gunfighter until he was challenged and shot in the ass by a 6-year-old child. And that led to him to be a boozer from that day forward. And it has been acknowledged that they were inspired by this little speech from the Twilight Zone. But yeah, that's one of those classic tropes, you know.
There's a great film, I feel like it's a little bit forgotten, called The Gunslinger, it's the same, you know, that's a, you know, feature-length film that kind of has a similar, you know, the fastest gun in the West. Everyone wants to come. He's just tired of it and he's trying to escape.
Yeah, it's funny when I watch Westerns, especially Western TV shows, whenever there's someone who's the best at something, then they're always going to be challenged or people are always looking to take them down. If you're known as the fastest draw then the guys are coming. Or if you're Maverick, there's, the biggest deal gambler, they're all trying to take you down and want, either accuse you of cheating or they want to get to the table and take you down, whatever. So, I mean, it's just a really nice, tight little episode. It's another episode that benefits from the fact that they were able to make use of standing sets that were on, I think this was on the MGM lot where so when you look at that Western set and you're like, oh my God, they had to build, like, no, they didn't have to build any of that. That was all there. I don't have the list of credits where that set probably is from, but it's probably dozens of movies and TV shows have probably used the same saloon and everything, the jail and everything else that you can see there. But that was one of the reasons why Western didn't cost quite as much to make. I mean, the biggest expense sometimes would be horses, quite frankly, in a lot of Westerns, because they would use, they would tend to recycle a lot of the same sets that had been built, sometimes had been built 25 years earlier.
And by the way, I'm going to correct myself. The Gunfighter is the movie I was thinking of. It was Gregory Peck, so it was a big star. But it's a good movie to look up. One thing, I know we're going to move on here shortly, but there, from a business perspective on this episode, in some ways, this episode sort of saved the Twilight Zone a little bit because it was getting critical acclaim the first few episodes, but it wasn't getting real ratings in the first couple episodes, at least not what CBS was hoping for. And so the initial numbers of the first couple episodes weren't that great. And it was sort of in jeopardy as, hey, is it going to even make it? And this one got a respectable rating. Still wasn't what they were hoping for, but enough to attract enough audience that it would survive its hiatus that it would have in November and continue through the first season. So, sort of a little bit of a speed bump episode that it survived.
Wow, I did not know that. The thing I also find fascinating about the episode, and then I'll move on to my closing comments, grades, and so on about it. What I love about this episode is it's the third episode. And when you line up the first three Twilight Zone episodes, the variance and difference from genre to, the type of characters and the stories that are being told, at least in the first three, are so wildly different. And it's really kind of putting on full display what Serling and the show would be capable of. So I really like that. So I really enjoy the very first three episodes of the series. And I think this one was actually shot second. I think this one was shot before the second one, but they put them in a different order for whatever reason. So, okay. Like I did last time, and I actually am keeping track of all the stuff. I've already built up an Excel board that I have at the office. So on my lunch hour, I start inputting all the information that I talk about on the podcast. So once again, written by Rod Serling. Check. Tropes, which is the word we use for that content. Well, first of all, it's a Western. That's a genre we're going to see a number of more times on the Twilight Zone. Alcoholism. That's something we will see pop up on the Twilight Zone quite a few times. Now, this is going to be kind of nebulous sounding, and I don't care because I don't have a better way to put it. The past and how that impacts or infects a person's life, which is something this and the next episode certainly have in common, only with very different outcomes. And I'm going to say that the peddler, or bless his heart, who's even named Fate, is in fact the personification of fate. So we have another personification of an idea.
And that's what I meant by, the Twilight Zone hits you over the head.
Yeah.
The guy's name is Fate. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And by the way, special shout out to Malcolm Atterbury, the character actor you mentioned there, because he just has the right look for that. Is he a guardian angel? Is he evil? Is he good? It's pretty vacant there. He's just, he's whatever he is, a Greek chorus, whatever name you want to apply to him. But he's there to kind of, as the name implies, just sort of, nudge Al Denton along.
He's also, if I'm not mistaken, he's one of I think there's at least 3 actors in this episode who all appear in at least one Alfred Hitchcock movie. He's one of them. Landau, of course, and I forgot to write down his name. I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head because I don't have it in front of me. But the actor who played the bartender, is also who is an actor who looks familiar. If you've watched enough things of that era, we all kind of recognize him. He's actually in North. He's also in North by Northwest, along with Martin Landau. I think he's a cop in that. Maybe he's one of the cops who arrests Cary Grant earlier on or something, if I'm not mistaken.
I have something to say about that in our next episode about that.
Oh, I can hardly wait. I know I know where we're going with that one. Yay. Anyway, the tone of this episode, I'd say it's, initially sad, but ultimately I wouldn't say it's tragic. It ends up being somewhat more heroic and hopeful, so it's kind of a sort of good feeling, although I've seen this before in Westerns. It's usually TV show Westerns. Why is it that there's always this magical thing about how the gun is shot out of someone's hand, and their hand, and there's not a drop of blood. It's like, wait, in fact, they even do that in Blazing Saddles, if I'm not mistaken. I think he shoots it out of all their hands, and I didn't see a drop of blood in any of those guys' hands. All right, so finally we have my little grade system. First, the ending / twist, which here it's the reveal that both Doug McClure and Dan Durier's characters both have those vials that they clearly have both gotten from fate, and naturally they both shoot each other's hands. I'd say the vial reveal and the reactions are kind of worthwhile. And, it's nice that Denton actually gets a happy ending, though I do worry about what the Landau character might do now that Denton can't shoot a gun anymore. So the ending twist, I kind of give it a 6.5. The overall grade, I said from the top that I really like this episode and I applaud it for its simplicity, and I'm a sucker for Westerns. So I'm probably going to go a little higher than maybe some might say it deserves. I'm going to give it a 7. I'm going to give it a solid 7. So let's move on to the next episode, which was the 16mm Shrine. This was directed by Mitchell Leisen. I don't know if it's pronounced Leisen or Leisen, but I'm gonna go Leisen until I'm told otherwise. He was a fairly well-accomplished film director going all the way back to the 1930s with films like Death Takes a Holiday, the big broadcast of 1937 and 38 films, as well as films that were written by the likes of Preston Sturges and Billy Wilder himself. He also directed 2 more Twilight Zone episodes, one that we'll be talking about on the very next podcast, in fact. And possibly his most famous episode that he directed happens in the 2nd season. It's the one titled People Are Alike All Over. You may not know the title, but man, you'll remember the twist for that one. This episode, once again, was written by Rod Serling. And Joe, this episode, I would say, features a couple of, at least in my mind, a couple of Hollywood luminaries. I'm going to leave it to you to tell us about them.
Well, yeah, and the star of the episode is Ida Lupino, and Ida Lupino, other than having almost somewhat of a famous name, a lot of times referenced as a punchline and things, but just because it was such a fun name to say, she had a pretty amazing career as not only an actress but also as a director. And as I hate to label it such, but it was a big deal at the time, a female director. She is the only person who stars in a Twilight Zone episode and directs an episode. And it's a later season one, but it's a good one. The Masks. And when we get to that, and I think a lot of people know that one. So she directed that and starred in this, but she has like more than 100 episodes of television shows in all kinds of genres: Western, supernatural, situation comedies, murder mysteries, gangster. So, I mean, that's a pretty incredible career as a director. Again, in putting it in the context of the time for a woman. And she did a lot of films too. I'm not negating her film career, but I find that that's pretty fascinating that she had a whole second career behind the camera. Another luminary there is a great character actor, Martin Balsam. That's probably who you were thinking I was going to mention, but that's not what I was going to mention, actually. But Martin Balsam, from so many things, and just a year later, he's going to be working with Hitchcock and Psycho, and he's done so many things over his great career. One of the person I was thinking that I was like, oh, that guy, what do I know that guy? And I had to look him up, and that was Ted DeCorsia. And he plays the kind of the bad studio head or production guy, whatever he is, Marty Saul. And he was in like a bunch of film noirs in the 50s and stuff. And Kubrick's The Killing, which I know very well, he was a cop in that, when a corrupt cop, and I was like, that's where I know him from. So it was kind of fun to see him in that role as well.
Yeah, he's great. One little bit of trivia about Martin Balsam I want to throw in before you go any further, because it's important Twilight Zone wise. Not just the fact that he is going to be in another Twilight Zone episode. He actually starred in what's considered what was really sort of the pilot for the Twilight Zone, which was an episode of the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse called The Time Element. And that was what kind of put Twilight Zone, in the minds of Serling getting this thing done. But it was first something he did on another program called The Time Element. It's kind of like, I don't know if I don't know if Twilight Zone would count as a spin-off from that, since they didn't call it the Twilight Zone. But it's sort of kind of like the Happy Days came from, what was it, Love American Style?
Love American Style.
Sort of, kind of, but not exactly. But since it was Martin Balsam, I was like, he does have a significant part of Twilight Zone history.
You want me to go ahead and read the opening?
Yes, sir.
So this is the 16 millimeter shrine. It was original air date October 23rd, 1959, if we haven't already said that. And here's the opening. And I'm almost afraid I'm going to break into a Rod Serling impression. I won't try to do that, but I might just end up going that direction.
Do it.
Picture of a woman looking at a picture. Movie great of another time. Once brilliant star in a firmament of no longer a part of the sky, eclipsed by the movement of earth and time. Barbara Jean Trenton, whose world is a projection room, whose dreams are made out of celluloid. Barbara Jean Trenton, struck down by hit-and-run years and lying on an unhappy pavement, trying desperately to get the license number of fleeting fame. And it's sort of interesting because he doesn't end that with, in the Twilight Zone or something, which he does in the closing. And just because I'm here, I'll read that. Well, no, I'll save the closing for later because let me just give a quick recap of the episode. So Barbara Jean Trenton is a once famous Hollywood actress. She spends all of her days locked away in a darkened screening room in her home or mansion, endlessly watching her old films and longing for the past. She's refusing to accept that time has moved on and that her youthful stardom has faded. She rejects the attempts from her agent, who is played by Martin Balsam, to bring her back into the present. Her obsession deepens, reality and fantasy begin to blur for her, and in what can only really be described as a surreal climax, she mysteriously vanishes into the silver screen, joining the glamorous world of her past films while leaving behind only a discarded scarf. And the episode sort of serves as a meditation on nostalgia, the fleeting nature of fame, the dangers of living in a world that no longer exists. I would even say it might even predate, or well, not predate because the disease existed at the time, but feels almost like an Alzheimer's kind of a thing, riff a little bit. But that's the episode. And then the final closing: to the wishes that come true, to the strange mystic strength of the human animal who can take a wishful dream and give it a dimension of its own. To Barbara Jean Trenton, movie queen of another era, who has changed the blank tomb of an empty projection screen into a private world. It can happen in the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, some of the earlier episodes, like the one just before this one, if I'm not mistaken, Serling wouldn't necessarily end his opening with the Twilight Zone. I think he always does it either in the beginning, or he's more likely to do it at the end. Sometimes he might do it in both. But I know I was very aware that I was like, oh, he didn't say in the Twilight Zone. They're like, oh, but he's gonna do it, but he does it at the end. There it is.
Exactly. And I'm just gonna start with the elephant in the room to kick us off here.
I know exactly what I'm gonna bet my life on it.
As I'm reading this description to some of you out there, you might be thinking, especially if you hadn't seen her, like, well, gee, that sounds familiar. It's so close to Billy Wilder's great film Sunset Boulevard. I had a hard time disassociating it between that. For those who aren't familiar, Sunset Boulevard is one of the great movies about movies or about the entertainment industry. And, another homework assignment: if you haven't seen it, go see that this week. But it's so similar with Norma Desmond, basically, just kind of going mad, wishing she was her old glamorous Hollywood self. And uh, so I have I don't want to say love hate, because I don't hate this episode by any stretch. But it's just like I have a hard time getting past that as like, gee, Rod Serling, you should be more original than that.
I absolutely agree. I I feel my love for the series is renowned enough, but I can also be critical of it as well. Because thankfully, generally speaking, most episodes I won't be. This turns out to be the first one where I'm a little, and that was like reason number one at, top of the list. It's like, okay, we're doing a poor man's Sunset Boulevard here. And there have been a few other stories similar to that, but this one, especially because, it was only, I don't know how many years later. Was it 3-4 years after?
It's not that long.
Because Sunset Boulevard was like mid-50s, I thought.
It might have been earlier than that, but whatever it is, this comes after Sunset Boulevard. That's
I can look it up
more
later.
Important thing there.
So however, where I'll give it credit though, the fact that they're basically able to go through that kind of idea concept and tell that story as quickly as they do, and with perhaps a much more, WTF kind of an ending than the iconic ending actually of Sunset Boulevard.
By the way, 1950, so a little earlier than we thought. So it was 9 years.
9 years, 1950. Because I thought, oh, that's the same year as Strangers on a Train. Really? Wow, that's a great year for movies. Okay. For some reason, I just know that was 1950. I think what's interesting about both works, and because this is also somewhat reflective of what Lupino herself was going through, because one of the things I really loved in this episode, I'll talk about the positive stuff, because there's nothing I hated. It's just the overall impact the episode had on me. Mm-hmm. It just reminded me of other things either before or the evenings that came after, which I preferred. But the scene when she's taken to see her, the producer, the fellow you were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And one of her first things she says when she realizes that the part they have her is playing a mother. And
I with this too, I think.
And when she starts to lose it, I don't play mother. And that's kind of like a really well-known thing, especially from a certain era of Hollywood, how quickly actresses would go from playing, ingenue. To that happened to Myrna Loy. Myrna Loy goes from being, Nick and Nora and everything from the late 30s going into the 40s, and then all of a sudden, a couple years later, she's a mom. She's playing
Donna
moms.
Reed, another example. Yeah.
But the reason I use Myrna Loy because I always had a huge crush on Myrna Loy, and I was like going, wait a minute, and then like 2 or 3 years later, it's like, yeah. You've reached your expiration date. You got to start playing moms now or whatever. It just, but Hollywood would do that. And it's not like they were already like in their 50s and 60s. No. Like, oh no, you're 35. You got to start playing a mom now or something like that. So I thought of that when that scene happened. It's like, well, that's a very accurate reflection of the way Hollywood would treat actresses, especially. Even though in this case, someone who had kind of been out of the business for so long, think of it now, if someone was offered like a little supporting part, they would jump on that because sometimes that can lead to bigger and better things. But back then it wasn't viewed that way, especially when you've got the ego that this character has.
Well, there was when Amy Schumer had her anthology show, they did a sketch that was pretty famous or pretty viral about that very topic. And you're right. It is, again, I don't want to overuse the word trope, but it's a very real thing in Hollywood when the actresses age out into the next phase of their actable careers, being mothers or beyond.
Oh yeah, it's just the way it was. Meanwhile, but the actors just keep getting their parts, and they just start being involved with younger and younger women. I mean, yeah, you can say, well, it's Cary Grant. What do you expect? It's Cary Grant. But like, Yeah, but you notice all of Cary Grant's co-stars from like 20, 30 years ago, they're either not getting work or they might be playing grandmas at this point.
Well, it
I
was
mean,
just interesting too at the time frame, when she says a 40ish, and I'm thinking from our modern perspective, that doesn't seem like much of anything. I mean, there's a lot of you know very sexy actresses that we have today that are well over 40 and into their 50s even.
true.
But even still today, there is that transition into later roles, whatever they might be. But I just the number 40ish when she said that, I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem all that that big a deal. And I don't want to step on what you're saying there, but in the same vein of sort of time, and this is a little bit of a criticism perhaps from my perspective. The time difference between her present day in the episode and her heyday doesn't really seem distant enough. It's like 20 years ago. That was 20 years ago. I'm like, 20 years ago is a while, but it's not like 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, when she was a big star and now she's an older woman or something. So I just sort of felt like that was a bit of a disconnect for me. That, well, okay, she's going through this mid or late life crisis, whatever you want to call it, but it wasn't that long ago that she was a star.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you necessarily about that. The only way I would try to look at it and how you can make it make sense and make it work. So they're filming. We're going on the assumption, I think we should, that when this episode takes place present day, based on everything we're seeing, it's present day. So therefore, this episode's supposed to take place in 1959. And we indicate that they keep talking about 20 years, or I don't know if they said 20 or 25, whatever. She's from an actress from the 30s, 1930s. So the way I would look at it is like, well, think about certain actresses who were a big deal in the 30s and where they were in 1959 in their career and how they were looked at. And they could be a big star. I mean, think about how Bette Davis was looked at in 1959 compared to the Bette Davis of the 30s and 40s. I mean,
Or Joan Crawford.
Or Joan Crawford. Who I was going. That's where I was going, because whatever happened to Baby Jane, knits those two together. Or people that are like, do you remember what Claudette Colbert was doing in 1959? Do you remember seeing her in anything other than maybe she was showing up on TV? Like, she's basically Ida Lupino, and stuff like that. Or you see you have these long stretches where all of a sudden you didn't see actresses for a while. You had the occasional exception. You had your Katharine Hepburn, kind of, who obviously at that point was out now, but she was playing the older roles, as they say. But sometimes they would just disappear for a while. You didn't see Ingrid Bergman for a while there, and then she kind of came back. You didn't see Lauren Bacall for a little while there, and then she kind of came back. But it's just, so if you look at it that way, it kind of makes sort of sense, because your career tended to end a lot quicker back then than it tends to happen now, I think. At least that's the way I rationalize it.
Yeah, and I'm being a little nitpicky here. I give you that. You're absolutely correct in everything you just said, but I think this is where my inability to disconnect from Sunset Boulevard hampers my enjoyment of the episode a bit, because that didn't feel that way in Sunset Boulevard. Norma Desmond felt appropriately old or appropriately disconnected from. Now, in that film, she was a silent
film actress, which
so that was maybe a little extra level there, and maybe because it's TV and budget or whatever. But Ida Lupino didn't look significantly older than her on-screen persona that she was playing there, at least not comparison to her co-star Jerry, which we can talk about in a moment. But so, like I said, that's a perfect example of my like I said, my struggle with wanting to like this for the concept that it is. And I love the concept. I love it in Sunset Boulevard. I love it here. I love the story. And I like the ending of this. I mean, we didn't spell it out yet, but the ending of this is very different than Sunset Boulevard's ending. And you can say which is better or worse or just different. That's a matter of opinion. But I just kept comparing it to Sunset Boulevard, and that's probably unfair, but I couldn't stop myself.
I understand. It's hard to get past that. It was in my head. I mean, when I'm critiquing it later, that was part of my critique from when I get to the grades of it as well. Like I said, there's a lot that I like in the episode, But it's interesting. One of the things I don't care for very much is also, and this is the first of the first, because we're looking at them chronologically speaking. This is the first episode where I didn't feel quite as much sympathy for the main character as I did in the first three. And it's not that her plight isn't sympathetic. It's just the character and the way she's portrayed is a bit more, will put you off a bit more. She's a bit more grating. She's a bit more annoying. And it may be understandable. It certainly is because of her, the way she views the world and everything. But and I don't mind the character being likable or not. I don't care. In fact, I love a lot of unlikable characters. But I didn't really care for her very much. And it just, so I wasn't as invested in however the story was going to turn out. This is also, by the way, just to be honest, I didn't remember this episode that well. I was like, oh yeah, I knew Ida Lupino was in an episode. It's some sort of Hollywood thing, but I had no recollection of it. So when I watched it, it was almost like it was new to me as well. I just didn't remember it. I do like all the character actors who show up in this. Obviously Martin Balsam goes without saying. Love Martin Balsam. I was first introduced to Martin Balsam. I think I saw Psycho for the first time when I was also a kid watching Archie Bunker's Place. I was like, hey, that's the guy from Archie Bunker's Place. And then someone showed me Taking a Pelham 1, 2, 3. And I was like, oh my God, he's the best actor in the world.
Yeah.
But the actor that you mentioned before, I've seen him in a number of things. Always love that guy. And when we meet the older version of the actor that she was so fond of, I've seen that actor a number of times as well. And it's all these, one of the great things about watching the Twilight Zone, you can see all these very familiar character actors, which were on so many movies and TV shows of the era. And you'd be like, oh, their names we won't not necessarily know, but there's almost like a comfort in seeing them. Like, oh, they always feel lived in their roles. They probably just came in for the day. What are my lines? Got it. And they knocked it out. And that guy in that scene when he sees her, it's such a good scene.
Well, and I agree with you in terms of her being somewhat unlikable. Now, I do think that Martin Balsam's character and her maid are kind of a conduit for us as the audience to want to give her sympathy because they're feeling sorry for her. They're this woman that they care about or love in a certain way is losing it, and they don't, they feel sorry for her. They feel, and that's sort of why, and again, I don't want to get into an awkward sidetrack of like Alzheimer's, but people who go through that struggle with loved ones, it's heartbreaking. I just felt that element a little bit in that. And now on the flip side, though, I do think that Serling as a writer and the way it's constructed and acted, they do give a little bit of, it's almost less of a cautionary tale as well as, or maybe both, kind of a celebration of nostalgia. Because in the end, I kept thinking, in the end, as I kind of already said, she literally goes into the screen and joins her, old co-stars in the 30s or whenever it was, and she's happy. And I'm thinking to myself, if I could do that, if I could go back to the 70s, when I was a little kid and had so many wonderful, happy times, I might do that. I might take that choice, and that's a whole, dissertation of psychology, perhaps. But, it's not as I think it stops short of being this horrific thing happened to this, and she's now trapped in the screen or whatever. And especially there was a little bit of a disconnect when we see through Sally's perspective. We don't see yet what has happened to her, and she screams like it's this horrific thing, and that sort of makes it think like, oh my God, she's paralyzed or something. But that wasn't the way it is. It's almost a happy ending for her.
That's a very interesting way to look at it. And maybe that is the way that many, I don't know, maybe the majority of people will look at it. I actually look at it a different way. And it's funny because something you were saying kind of becomes part of how I view it. While I wasn't going as far as to think specifically of Alzheimer's, but something similar to that. Because this, by the way, I get to mention it twice in one episode. This very much as much as it reminds me of Sunset Boulevard, which came years earlier, I also think about one of the all-time great Columbo episodes, which was done about 15 years later, which starred Janet Leigh as an aging former big glamorous movie star who would sit in her room watching films and remembering her past and wanting to be, dancing and singing again like she did. So, 20, roughly probably 20 years earlier, because that episode was done in the mid 70s. And she's obviously looking at things that were from like the mid 50s. So there you go. There's your 20-year gap, whatever. And that there's a certain sadness and tragedy to that because, she murders somebody and doesn't remember doing it. And I thought here, because the delusion has built up so much, she falls prey to it. She just becomes part of it. So now she's going to forever be living in this, in the delusion of what what she's created here. And yes, that's one of those things where because she is happy, then one can say it's a happy ending. And I get that. And that may be the way it should be taken. I personally look at it more as a tragic ending.
No, you're absolutely right. And I don't want to, when I was describing the quote unquote happy ending version that I was sort of, intimating there, it was just like a brushstroke maybe of the theme, not the overwhelming, because certainly to the outsiders, it's very sad and very tragic. And you could easily just take it that way and leave it and not, think anything else. But I was just saying from, Barbara Jean Trenton's perspective, she's happy. And the other thing that's a little bit vague here is, is she dead or is she just trapped in another dimension, of the screen? And that kind of changes it a little bit too, because, and they're intentionally vague about that because she throws the scarf out into the room and the scarf is still real. So, in the way Sally screamed a little bit earlier in that episode, I was thinking, oh my God, she's dead and she's trapped in this thing and she can't get out or whatever. I can't think of a specific example, but we've seen, content over the years. I can't believe I just said that. Over the years that where people get trapped in the television or in a scary way, like, oh my God, I can't get out, I'm trapped in here. And and that wasn't really the case here, even though Sally's scream almost indicated like that would be the case. But to Barbara Jean Trenton, I'm sorry, she's happy, and at the end of the day, maybe that's a good thing.
I don't know who's going to be paying Sally anymore, so she might have a good reason to be screaming at that point. Plus, it's just the bizarreness of the situation. If you see, the woman you work for, and pretty much seems like your only human contact you ever have, quite frankly, and suddenly she's somehow been transported onto the movie screen, which makes you wonder, hey, so when you turn off the projector, does that turn off that world? Is it gone? Whatever. Is she forever? Is she in the film strip at this point? If you were to hold it up to the light, the way I look at it, that's one of the lovely things about the Twilight Zone and the way they end many episodes and the way Sterling phrases thing. It's like, you know where she is? She's in the Twilight Zone. It's just the Twilight Zone is like the biggest multiverse of them all, and everyone who's trapped somewhere, they're all in one specific pocket of it. Either they're in a zoo or or on a moon or a planet or in a film. Or in an old film.
One thing that struck me here, and this is possibly going to be an obscure kind of reference, but maybe people pick up on it. But I was thinking, and again, as talented as Ida Lupino was, and I think she acted just fine in this episode. I don't have any criticisms of that. But I just even as a young woman, I never found her as particularly glamorous. And whereas again, comparing it to Sunset Boulevard, Norma Desmond was at least exotic. I don't know if glamorous is the right word, but she was an exotic looking woman. Whereas Ida Lupino is, more character actress, for lack of a better word. And I kept thinking, I have a favorite character actress that I love and every little thing she does, Marie Windsor. And I don't know if you know who she is or if our audience does. And if you saw her face, you would probably know who she was. But she's sort of got that exotic look, and she would have been, around appropriate for that role around that time. And I kept thinking, boy, I'd like to see Marie Windsor in this. And again, that's just sort of a random thing that popped into my head. But look her up if you don't know where she is.
Alrighty then.
One more thing before I forget.
Sure.
I've been calling out this whole Sunset Boulevard thing over and over again. The music of this was done by Franz Waxman, who's a very well-renowned movie composer. We talked about Bernard Herrmann in previous episodes. He also did the music for Sunset Boulevard. So I'm not saying, that means anything exactly, but it's just, again, I find that.
Oh no, it means something.
Yeah.
That's not an accident.
Yeah.
That's certainly not an accident. It's meant to, I thought I saw that and I was wondering if you were going to mention it, and I kind of forgot about it, but I thought, when I saw the note of who had done it, because on the DVD you can actually just watch it. You can watch with the isolated score by Franz Waxman. It's like, ooh, that must be, he's a big deal. And I was like, that name sounds familiar to me. And I looked up like, oh, okay. I see it now.
No, he's not as known as Bernard Herrmann
but
he's a big deal.
I strongly suspect one of the main reasons they brought him in was to evoke, Sunset Boulevard for what they were doing here.
And just one other note on the music, and this is not about Franz Waxman, but one thing we always talk about, the opening theme of the Twilight Zone, and especially when we get to the famous one and the more famous one, I guess I should say, in the second season and such. The end credit music is always very moving to me, or maybe moving isn't the right word, but ominous, and it's not even melodic, so I can't really even hum it here. But the that was terrible. Let's edit that out. But
No.
but the point I'm trying to make is, I'd forgotten how evocative, that's the word I want, the end credit music is of what we just saw. Like, and it's true for all the episodes, really. It's like we just went into the Twilight Zone, and now we're decompressing as we watch these credits or whatever. And it's really good.
Yeah. Hey, we kind of modeled the way we do the opening and closing music for this podcast after that. So anyone who chooses to listen, you'll notice that our ending music is decidedly different than our opening music. And one of the concepts that I batted back and forth with Brian, and he came up with that one pretty quickly after a few shots at it, is like, yeah, I want it to be more similar to how the show ends, at least for this season, because again, we're going to be changing it from season to season. Okay, so let me quickly run through the things about the episode. Again, written by Rod Serling. Here we go again. Check. Here's where we can use the word tropes, because that's the category. So we got a few here. I don't know. I'm trying to think of one word that can encapsulate, the entertainment biz or showbiz or Hollywood. I wrote showbiz, but I kept thinking, I feel Hollywood's probably the word, because that's usually what it is. Either it's going to be film or television or whatever. It's kind of, because that's going to be something we're going to see on the Twilight Zone quite often. Aging itself is another major thing, which is also something we're going to see dealt with quite often on the Twilight Zone. That thing I said about the past, it's a big thing for this episode. It's
going to be the next one. I'm not going to be part of it. You guys are going to cover that next time.
Oh yeah, it's interesting to see how many times that idea comes up. There's probably a few others I could think of, but I'm kind of moving a little bit quicker now. The overall, for me, I believe the overall tone of the episode, ultimately, it's a fairly sad and tragic episode. That's just the way I view it, and that's the way I'm kind of categorizing it. Moving on to the actual ending and twist and how I grade that. Okay, the bizarre nature of what happens, that by itself, I like to give a thumbs up to. But I gotta be honest, you know what was kind of bothering me? The constant utterance of "I wish" being somehow connected to what happens. That part, for whatever reason, never really works for me. That's like the only thing in the episode I felt Serling was kind of pushing it a little bit, and almost wish I felt like you didn't really even need to have that there. It felt like, oh, we need something to be specifically an incantation of something to be said that shows why this leads to that. It's like, No, you don't need, I don't think you needed that. I don't think that was necessary. I think that's the part that's not subtle that doesn't need to be in the episode. I think it would have worked just as well without that, and they could have come up with a better way to do it. Can't believe I'm critiquing Rod Serling, but Jesus. So the grade for the ending, to 5.5 from me. And the overall episode, like I said, it's not my favorite main character from an episode of the Twilight Zone. That doesn't help it. There's the Sunset Boulevard. I also had a problem. I couldn't get that out of my head either. I'm actually going to give the episode a 5 out of 10. So that brings this episode of the podcast to a near close. Joe, I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. Feel free, if you want to take a moment, to let folks know where they can find out more about you online.
Yeah, you can check out my website, joefortunato.net, and that has all the things I'm doing. I do a weekly radio segment about classic movies. It's only 10 minutes, so it's a quick listen. You can find that on joefortunato.net. And then on occasion, I'll do live screenings that are streamed, and that would be something people can check into. Anyway, just go to the website and you'll find out all the things I'm doing.
Good man. Great. Now for the listeners, the next Twilight Zone podcast, which should be in roughly 2 weeks' time, we will be covering the next 2 episodes from Twilight Zone Season 1, a wistful journey called Walking Distance, and a devilishly fun escape clause. I hope you all will join us then. Thank you, and good night.